introduction to India's foreign policy, I would like to just talk a bit on the concepts of colonialism, imperialism, neo-colonialism, etc. In a layman's perspective. I am not talking in terms of the political scientist's view and various definitions and things like that. We don't require. Please remember, in our general studies, what is required is more of a layman's understanding, a general understanding, and slight distinction between all these things. If you know, it is very easy to prepare. Otherwise, as a political scientist or a political science expert, you can keep on talking about imperialism and colonialism, neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism and all in a big way, but I am not getting into that kind of a definition-wise details, but still we would like to make a distinction between all these terms. That is the purpose of this particular discussion and particular video. Now, so coming to this colonialism, the simple way to distinguish these two is to think of colonialism as a practice and imperialism as the idea driving the practice. So, how do you implement imperialism? It is through one of the ways in which you can implement imperialism is through colonialism. So, colonialism as a practice and imperialism as the idea driving the practice. So, imperialism is the idea. We will come to the difference in terms of the definition and all. So, colonialism as a practice and imperialism as an idea. Now, colonialism is the implanting of settlement on a distant territory. That means the Britishers coming and settling, or rather implanting of settlements on a distant territory. So, you go to a distant territory and start controlling and ruling them. So, you are managing it, you go and physically manage a distant territory. That is where the colonialism will come into picture. So, in fact, if you look at the modern day colonialism in its modern form, first began to take shape around 400 years before. 400 years before the modern day colonialism started taking shape, and it has completely changed the economic landscape of the world, no doubt regarding this. In fact, there was a time when Britishers used to claim that the sun never sets in the British Empire. So, it was there in all continents and everywhere, and they controlled and they managed everything. So, it has completely altered the economic landscape. There is a complete change in the economic landscape of the world. No doubt regarding this, it is completely altered. In fact, it enabled Europe to get fabulously rich on the trade it produced. In fact, they could get raw materials from across the globe and they could sell their finished products across the world, and they became fabulously rich and they became filthily rich because of the extraction of the raw materials from these colonies, and they were also able to sell this product back in the colonies. They made a lot of money, and the whole economic landscape got changed because of this colonialism. In fact, the foundations of what we now think as free market capitalism, the present day the foundations of the present day capitalism were invented during this colonial era, partly by to handle trade. In fact, the origin of the present day free market economy concept came from the colonial era, the East India Company and all. We have seen that in history, we see elaborately. Now, when it comes to, so that means in colonialism, these masters come and physically rule you, to exploit your resources, and to use your territory as a market and to further your economic interest. So, the direct rule to pursue your economic interest, that is how colonialism is done. Now, coming to the concept of imperialism, I said colonialism is a practice and imperialism is the idea behind that practice. So, imperialism, if you look imperialism, it has a very long history. It is associated even with, now when you come to imperialism, it is associated even with the ancient Roman Empire. And in fact, it did not begin. In fact, this term was not used much in the English speaking area till the late 1800s. So, till 1800s, this term imperialism was not much in use, but subsequently we started using. So, it has a specifically expansionist connotation, because an imperialistic policy of a state means we are trying to expand our influence beyond our borders. So imperialism as a word today has an expansionist connotation. It is an, you are crossing your boundary, you are going beyond your boundary, an expansionist connotation. And there is a expansionist mindset behind the word imperialism today. So what is imperialism? In a definition perspective, if you look, imperialism is a state policy or a practice. Let me just write, imperialism is a state policy or a practice or an advocacy of extending its power and dominion. You are beyond, you are extending, you are crossing your boundary and expanding your role by direct territorial acquisition. It can be either by direct territorial acquisition, or by gaining political and economic control of those areas, or by gaining political and economic control of those areas. So in imperialism, it's a state policy or a practice or an advocacy of extending power and the dominion, especially by direct territory. If it is a direct territorial acquisition, it is colonialism, or by gaining political and economic control of those areas. So you are trying to use your influence to spread your influence on other countries and other regions to suit your requirement. You are expanding. So if we say India is pursuing imperialistic policies with Nepal, we are trying to use our influence, economy, our political role in controlling the Nepal's economy and politics to suit India's requirement. So it always involves power. It always involves use of power, whether it is military power or economic power or some other form. Imperialism has often been considered morally reprehensible. It is not morally correct because we are using our influence to mold the politics of another country to suit our requirement. It is not considered to be a good thing. It is always been denounced and discredited if you want to discredit an opponent's foreign policy. The best way is to say that you are pursuing imperialistic policies. In fact, when we are moving closer to US, the critics of the India's foreign policy always say that US is trying to spread its imperialistic policies on India, and India is becoming subjugated to the US pressure, and we are dancing to the tune of the American policy. That is what many critics are always criticizing. In fact, if you look at the imperialistic policies, there are three periods in the modern era when it comes to the imperialism. There are three periods of imperialism, we can say, and the first one is right from the 15th century to the middle of 18th century, 15th to 18th century. That is the time when the Britishers, the French, the Spain, Portugal, the Iberian countries, all of them spread across the globe. And most of the Europeans tried to expand their influence. That is how India, Indonesia, most of the African countries, all of them came under the influence or the control of the colonial rule. So the first phase was the modern phase. In the modern phase, there are three phases. First, 15th century to 18th century. The second phase was the middle of the 19th century. That means around 1850s to First World War. From around 1850s to First World War. This is the time when the imperialistic policies of Russia, Italy, even US, they colonized the Philippines during that time. In 1900, Philippines came under the control of US. Japan, in a big way, they started expanding during this phase. So between the 1850s, the second phase, the first phase is 15th century to 18th century. Then 1850s to First World War, that is 1920. Then the third phase is between the war, Japan, Italy, Germany, the Nazis, the fascists, all of them tried to expand their influence between 1930s, 1930 to say 1945, we can say that's the third phase of the expansion of the imperialism. So in the modern time, we can talk about three periods in the modern era, one between 15th to 18th century, then middle of the 19th century, 1850s to First World War, then 1930s. These were the three phases of the imperialistic policies in the world, and we have seen the side effects and the negative effects of them. Now, when we talk about globalization, even globalization, I already told, this globalization is something, you can see the capitalism and the globalization and all, we can see right from the colonial era. But today globalization, when we talk about globalization, let me just talk about globalization also. In globalization, we are talking about a period, especially after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, after 1989. Following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the breakdown of the Cold War system. So that is how the globalization concept has started, and the globalization is characterized today by decay of national boundaries. We are crossing the national boundaries, decay of the national boundaries, and state institutions in favor of transnational economic activity. So we are talking in terms of transnational economic activity, transnational economic activity, and decay of the national boundaries, decay of national boundaries. And as I said, the state institutions are in the national boundaries, and state institutions are giving way to transnational economic activity. So globalization era is also characterized by intensified cross-cultural interaction, intensified cross-cultural interaction, intensified cross-cultural interaction. So in the globalized era, that is why we could even, because of globalization, even the coronavirus could spread very easily, very fast, because of the cross-cultural interaction. People are traveling across the world, so it could be taken from one place to another very easily. And also it has helped in the explosion of migration of various people in all directions. So migration of not only people, now even the culture, even diseases, all are migrating. So that is how, see, the globalization is characterized by cross-cultural interaction, migration, and also the movement of the people. So it's become a modern day phenomena today. And when we talk about the neo-colonialism, now colonialism is over, imperialism is over, but today the way when the developed countries try to